Number 1.
Based on a real case, the Italian thriller film Yara follows the mysterious disappearance of a 13-year-old girl from Brembate di Sopra, Bergamo, Italy. Yara Gambirasio went to the gym in the afternoon but never made it home. Prosecutor Letizia Ruggeri, played by Isabella Raganese, conducts a thorough investigation to find out the girl's whereabouts. Being a mother herself, Letizia sympathetically resonates with Yara's mother, Mora, and becomes consumed in the case. Let's follow the tracks of her investigation. The film opens with the events of February 26, 2011, when a local finds a decaying body of Yara Gambirasio in a field in Cignolo de Sola, near the Not Only Dance nightclub. The 13-year-old girl disappeared 3 months ago, on November 26, 2010. She went to her gym class to deliver a stereo system and never made it home. Prosecutor Letizia Ruggeri has been rigorously investigating the case. In the 3 months since Yara's disappearance, Letizia has failed to find any significant leads or evidence, and has been beating around the bush. However, as Yara's dead body is discovered, the authorities find foreign DNA on her body. Forensics reports a foreign male DNA sample labeled unknown 1. However, due to the lack of a DNA database in Italy, it becomes a laborious task to match it with a suspect. Letizia decides to create her own database from the samples of every man and woman in close contact with Yara or with her family and friends. However, for her extensive budget for collecting DNA samples, she received a backlash from the ministers, the media, and the people. Yet, ardently and patiently, Letizia continues the investigation to find the murderer. The forensic doctor informed Letizia that the male DNA belonged to an Indo-European man who might have light eyes. In the new course of the investigation, the Red Cross and FEMA workers set up campaigns to collect DNA samples. A year later, forensic police found a 50% match, and reported that a person named Damiano Garanoni was a direct relative of the unknown 1. Letizia collected the DNA of Garanoni's siblings, but didn't find an exact match. The forensic doctor, Crivelli, needed the DNA of their father, Giuseppe Garanoni, believing that Giuseppe could be the father of unknown 1 too, and unknown 1 might be the 4th sibling born outside of wedlock. However, Giuseppe died some 15 years ago, and so to find the leads, Letizia interrogated Giuseppe's wife. They found a DNA sample from Giuseppe's driving license, and Crivelli concluded that Giuseppe was the father of unknown 1, who was born from another woman. Giuseppe was a bus driver and served many towns up and down the Bergamo province. Hence, Letizia decided to collect the DNA samples of every woman in the area. That annoyed the people and Congress further. Letizia, in her crusade to find the killer, failed to gather any significant leads. In April 2013, 1 month before the case filing, Senator Nigiotti demanded an inquiry on Letizia's investigation and requested to replace her. The authorities pressured her to resign, but Letizia refused to give them up. Finally, a professor, Previdier, came to her rescue and informed Letizia about her researcher, Pierangela Grignani, who found an allele in unknown 1's DNA. An allele is a variant of a gene and is extremely rare. It wasn't present in Giuseppe's DNA, which concluded that he got it from his mother. The discovery narrowed the sample list, and the police found the mother of unknown 1, i.e., Esther Arzuffi. Esther had 3 children, among whom the younger one had been living abroad for several years. Out of the other 2 twins, the male child, Massimo Giuseppe Bissetti, matched with the DNA of unknown 1. Letizia concluded that Massimo assaulted and murdered Yara Gambirasio. Massimo was a 41-year-old carpenter who lived in Mapello. During the autopsy, officials found iron particles on Yara's clothes and lime residues in her lungs. It directly linked with Massimo's profession, and Letizia believed that Massimo assaulted Yara with his carpentry tools. According to the forensic, unknown 1 had light eyes, and Massimo matched the profile. After gathering significant evidence against Massimo Bissetti, the police arrested him and charged him for the murder of Yara Gambirasio. In 2015, Massimo was presented in the court of law, where he denied killing Yara. His defense lawyer tried his best to protect his client, but by now, the police had enough evidence to put Massimo behind bars. Even Massimo's wife accepted that Massimo was not at home on the evening of Yara's disappearance. On the evening of November 26, 2010, Massimo's cell phone pinged to the tower near Ruggeri Street. marking his presence near the area from which Yara disappeared. The authorities even presented CCTV footage that highlighted a truck similar to Massimo's vehicle. Massimo's defense refused to accept the theory cooked up by the police, but he didn't have enough evidence to save his client. On the last day of hearings, on July 1, 2016, the grand jury of Bergamo declared Massimo Bassetti guilty of murdering Yara Gambirasio and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Massimo appealed to the Supreme Court in October 2018, but the higher court confirmed his guilty verdict. In November 2019, Bassetti's defense requested access to the police findings for new evaluations, but the motion was rejected. On January 11, 2021, the Supreme Court ordered the Assize Court to schedule a hearing for Bassetti, and on June 3, the Assize Court rejected Bassetti's defense request to access the findings. Despite the rulings, Massimo never accepted the crimes. Hence, the police never found out how Bassetti kidnapped Yara. They never found out the reason why Yara sat inside Bassetti's van. Letizia theorized that because Bassetti worked on the same building site as Yara's father, he probably knew him and Yara. On the day of her disappearance, she was getting late for home, and probably Bassetti persuaded or forced her to get into his van. However, the real reasons remain unknown, as Bassetti never confessed to kidnapping Yara. Bassetti's wife mentioned Bassetti's brother-in-law in a conversation with Bassetti. However, the film didn't explain his involvement at all. It left a lot of loose ends because probably Letizia wanted to find a closure for the case. Yara is a 2021 Italian crime drama film directed by Marco Tullio Giordana. It is based on a real case that revolved around the disappearance of a 13-year-old girl.
Number 2.
On Mother's Day, 1985, the bodies of Kathryn Eastburn and two of her children, Cara and Aaron, were found brutally murdered in their Fayetteville, North Carolina home. The Eastburns were a military family, and matriarch Kathryn was used to raising her three children: 5-year-old Cara, 3-year-old Aaron, and 21-month-old John alone, while her husband served in the Air Force. The Eastburns' neighbors, Army Sergeant Bob Seafolt and his wife, made the discovery. The couple became worried when they realized they hadn't seen Kathryn and the children in a few days. Upon hearing baby John's cries, the Seafolts knew something terrible had happened. They were right. It was determined that on May 9, 3 days prior to the discovery, Kathryn, Cara, and Aaron had been murdered. The suspect, a fellow member of the Fayetteville military community, Army Staff Sergeant Timothy Hennis, had answered the Eastburns' classified ad, offering a dog for sale, just days before the murders took place. Prosecutors built their case against the suspect, but putting him away was anything but easy. While the first trial led to a conviction, Hennis appealed the ruling and was found not guilty. Then, prosecutors tried Hennis a third time after introducing new DNA evidence and discovering a loophole in double jeopardy laws. This new trial led to a guilty verdict. Today, Tim Hennis sits on death row in an Army prison. But will his defense team file yet another appeal? Scott Wisnant's true crime book Innocent Victims, which includes a new epilogue detailing the controversial third trial and conviction, examines a case that you won't easily forget. But by Sunday morning, he was worried about those newspapers piled up, the car in the same place, and the stroller next to the side door, where it had been for 3 days. "I'm going over there to see if anyone's home," he told his wife. He picked up the Sunday paper, dated May 12, 1985, and tossed it and the others into the carport. He sidestepped the baby's stroller and knocked on the side door. No answer. Then he rang the front doorbell a few times. Nothing. He rang it again. A baby cried. Seafolt thought it sounded like Jonna, 21 months old. He rang the doorbell again. Another cry. Katie Eastburn couldn't possibly have left her toddler alone in the house. Seafolt wondered if he heard right. But what else sounds like a baby crying? He called Jeanette over to see if she could hear the cry. He rang again. "That's the baby," Jeanette said. "Call somebody," Seafolt instructed with more confidence than he felt. Jeanette fumbled through the phone book, but the pages shook in her hands. She found a listing for Julie Cherniak, the Eastburns' babysitter who lived a few houses away. "Julie, I think something terrible has happened," she said. Julie gave her the Eastburns' number, and Jeanette called. The phone rang and rang. "Please let her answer," Jeanette whispered. She let it ring some more. She next tried the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. At 12:53 p.m., the dispatcher relayed a child neglect call. Deputy William Toman was patrolling nearby on Santa Fe Drive, checking stores along Bragg Boulevard until his shift ended. He heard the call and figured he was closer to Summerhill than anyone. Toman told the dispatcher he'd handle it and arrived 4 minutes later at 367 Summerhill Road. Julie beat Toman to the house. "John is standing there in her crib," she told Seafolt. "Why wasn't someone going in to get her?" Julie ran to the back of the house and tried to open a bedroom window. "Don't touch nothing," Seafolt hollered. "Just go on," Julie told him. "I want to get in and find out." Deputy Toman showed up in no mood for nonsense. The sheriff's department had procedures to follow on child neglect calls, and Toman was not one to stray from procedures. He tried to make sense of what Julie was saying, then dismissed her as loud and irrational. Something about a child in a crib. Seafolt was still irritated that Julie was trying to break into the house. "All right, I'll handle it from here," Toman said before they could worry him further. Toman checked all the doors and windows. No forced entry. He found a note jammed inside the storm door. "Mrs. Eastburn, get in touch with your husband by phone. Deputy Price." Toman shrugged and rang the doorbell. No one stirred. No baby cried. Seafolt felt a little foolish. Neighbors began to gather in the street. Toman's sergeant drove up and was talking to the young deputy on the front porch. "What do you think we should do?" the sergeant asked. Toman wasn't sure. Then he heard the crying. He leaned over the porch railing, pressed his nose to the bedroom window, and cupped his hands at his temples. Little Jonna Eastburn stood in her crib, her arms outstretched to anyone. "I've got no choice," Toman told his sergeant. "I've got to go in." Toman stepped over the railing, sliced the screen, and lifted the window. He poked his head in and smelled death. Jonna wanted out of that room. Her white pajamas with blue and yellow flowers reeked. She was pale and gaunt, her eyes puffy from so much crying. A slew of stuffed animals and toys had been placed in her crib, as if someone expected Jonna to need entertaining for a while. She had tossed them onto the floor. Jonna wrapped both arms around Toman's neck, digging her tiny fingers into his back. "It's all right," he told her. "It'll be all right." He passed Jonna out the window to Seafolt and found a neatly stacked pile of Pampers next to the crib along with a bottle. He handed the diapers and bottle to Seafolt and turned to face the rest of the house. The smell was getting stronger. He steeled himself for a grisly body count. "It didn't matter how many bodies I found," he would say later. "I was more worried about what I was going to find alive."
Number 3.
1 June 21, 1977, 31-year-old Charlotte Moriarty left her house in Hala, Honolulu, Hawaii, with her 6-month-old son, Marx. She told her boyfriend at the time, Mark Barnes, that she was going to the store that was just a couple blocks away from their house. Marx's stroller was found later that day, but Charlotte and Marx had disappeared. According to Mark, it was not atypical of Charlotte, who was known as a free-spirited, bohemian type, to take off for days at a time without contacting anyone. So he didn't think much of it. Mark claims he contacted Honolulu police twice in the days following Charlotte and Marx's disappearance, but upon further review, no record of his reports could be found. It wasn't until 3 weeks after their disappearance that Honolulu police became involved in the case. Searches and distributed flyers proved futile. Charlotte and Marx were nowhere to be found. There was some suspicion of Mark, but no evidence linking him to Charlotte or Marx's disappearance. Then, 35 years later, a man by the name of Steve Carter began to investigate his life before being adopted at the age of 4. He knew that he was born in Hawaii, and it didn't take long before he discovered the missing baby Marx Barnes and his mother Charlotte. A DNA test would later confirm that Steve Carter was in fact Marx Barnes. Pieces of the puzzle were slowly put into place. It was discovered that the day after Charlotte and Marx disappeared, they were found in the home of a woman who called the police because Charlotte was acting erratically. Charlotte gave a false name for herself and Marx, Jana May and Tenzin May, and a false birth date for Marx. She was then taken to a psychiatric hospital while Marx was put into protective custody. Doctors did want to ultimately reunite the mother and son, but just a few days after being admitted, and against medical advice, Charlotte discharged herself from the hospital and left Marx in state custody. Marx was later placed into an orphanage not far from where he lived with his parents, and then later adopted. To this day, Charlotte's whereabouts remains a mystery. Mark Barnes believes that she is alive and will get in contact with him one day. Charlotte also has another daughter from a relationship previous to Barnes, who has not heard from her mother since. I saw this case on the ID show Gone and decided to do a quick write-up. Something that also struck with me while watching was that Mark said after giving birth, Charlotte would wear a blindfold all day and all night for 3 weeks, possibly a sign of postpartum depression, maybe psychosis. I'm glad for the happy ending in Steve's case. I still wonder about Charlotte though. Is she alive? If so, she will be 73 years old this year. Where did she go after leaving the hospital? There's so many scenarios that can be played out here.
Number 4.
In October of 1993, Lois Taylor entered the Harlem apartment of Dorian Corey, a drag performer and dressmaker who died of AIDS 2 months earlier at the age of 56. Accompanied by 2 men searching for Halloween costumes, Taylor, a fellow New York drag queen and caretaker of Corey in her final days, was hoping to sell them a small fraction of Corey's wardrobe. They rifled through fabric, feathers, and sequins before they encountered a large closet, where, Taylor said, the sight of a musty green plaid garment bag folded over on the floor piqued their collective interest. I only weigh 135 pounds. I couldn't lift that thing, Taylor told New York Magazine in 1993. Resigning to her powerlessness to find the zipper, Taylor handed a pair of scissors to one of the men, only to learn that what the curious mass lacked in portability, it made up for in distinct malodor. Without inspecting further, Taylor called the police, peeling through multiple layers, first the bag's fabric, then taped wrappings of what was likely naugahead, a type of faux leather, and plastic. Detectives revealed a grisly sight: a partially mummified body in the fetal position, its formerly brown complexion now purple and yellow, its ears mere cartilaginous vestiges, its blue and white boxer shorts tattered, with a bullet hole in its head. Encased within the layers, Detective Raul Figueroa observed, were detachable pull tabs from flip-top beer cans, whose prime in the United States ranged from the 1960s to the 1970s. Despite the technical hurdles posed by decay, Figueroa managed to extract fingerprints from the corpse. The body was identified as Robert Bobby Worley, born December 18, 1938. The only extant records from Worley's life were criminal. He'd been arrested for raping and assaulting a woman in 1963 and served 3 years in prison. By most accounts, he was estranged from his family and hadn't been seen since the mid to late 60s. Coupling this with Figueroa's pull-tab dating method, detectives concluded the shooting must have happened at least 20 years prior. Superficial cues might dictate that Dorian Corey had little reason to engage in violent crime. A graduate from the Parsons School of Design, she had a knack for graphic design, which she parlayed into repute as a costumer. In the Harlem drag ball scene, where veteran drag queens and their young breakdancing and voguing counterparts participated in tongue-in-cheek pageants to showcase humor, irony, and ambition through performance, Corey was a stalwart diva. Her experience led her to mentor and support young queens. As the mother of her drag family, the House of Corey, you lend money to your friends, not very much money, and give advice sometimes. If someone got evicted or whatever, you might take them in, she explained on a 1991 episode of The Joan Rivers Show. What stands in starkest contrast to the gruesome implications in her closet, perhaps, is Corey's demeanor. The most extensive video footage of Corey is from the 1990 Jenny Livingston documentary Paris is Burning, an examination of the aforementioned ball culture. In interviews, she was witty, realistic, and unflappable. In contrast to the grandiosity of aspiring models and housewives, she had a self-possessed cadence and world-weary observations, which endeared her to a comparatively mainstream audience. Everybody wants to make an impression, some mark upon the world, she says in the film. Then you think you've made a mark on the world if you just get through it, and a few people remember your name if you shoot an arrow, and it goes real high, hooray for you. Yet it's apparent, from her interviews and an alleged silence about her life with Worley, that Corey was also guarded. Considered in tandem with the circumstances of the discovery, plenty of questions remain. Why might she have committed murder? What was her relationship to Robert Worley? How and why was the body preserved and not disposed of? Despite a lack of evidence or sources who are still living, many queens who knew Corey have succumbed to either disease or violence. These questions have provoked a number of theories. Though the idea has now fallen out of favor, some posited that Corey was protecting the real murderer. In 1988, between the probable time of Worley's and Corey's deaths, Corey, moved from her apartment at 150th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue to one located 10 blocks over on West 140th Street. The notion that the body was in the closet before she moved, the hypothesis goes, is more plausible than that of Dorian's lugging a corpse from one home to another. Others maintain, more credibly, that Worley was a burglar who broke into Corey's home, prompting Corey to act in self-defense. Corey lived in later 20th century Harlem, where violent crime ran rampant. Livingston recalled numerous gunfights outside Corey's apartment during interviews for the film. For her own protection, she presumably owned a gun. Her friend Jessie Torres affirmed she had a little .22 in an interview. Shortly after news of the murder surfaced, more telling, Corey had allegedly attached a note to the body reading, "This poor man broke into my home and was trying to rob me." Furthermore, the theory suggests a possible reason she kept the body. A black drag queen who lived in a poor, dangerous area in the 60s or 70s had little chance of garnering sympathy from the police. Prevailing sentiment, however, contends that Corey and Worley had a turbulent romantic relationship that reached a tragic conclusion in a crime of passion. According to Taylor, Corey wrote a short, third-person story about a transgender woman who killed her lover after he browbeat her into having sex reassignment surgery. Handwritten on a piece of paper yellowed with age, the story seemed at least loosely autobiographical. Corey had had breast implants and possibly taken female hormones and was peppered with references to her life, including the Pearl Box Review, a touring drag show she'd performed with in the 60s. Additional clues point to this supposition. Torres had relayed that Corey, hospitalized and in a haze of acid and morphine, had confessed to her friend Sally in Corey's final days. Richard Mailman, whose upcoming play Dorian's Closet explores the story, says that, according to a police interview with Worley's brother, Worley showed up at his brother's house one night drunk, and he was going on and on and on about Dorian. There was that sort of corroboration that he was in a relationship and did know Dorian. Indeed, any relationship they had was fraught. Reg Flowers, whose one-man play Out of the Bag plumbs the psyche of Robert Worley, suggests that Worley may have struggled to reconcile the pressures of appearing masculine and straight with his attraction to Corey, lashing out at her in bouts of frustration. Being in a relationship with someone who was abusive would make sense as an explanation, especially when you're talking about when men are attracted to trans people, he says. My sense is that we're talking about someone who might be closeted about their homosexuality as well, and so there might have been all kinds of internalized hatred and internalized oppression. My sense of it is that it was a dangerous situation that Dorian needed to get out of. As for the body, Mailman postulates that Corey, fearing disposing of it, would be too conspicuous in congested Manhattan, covered it in baking soda, and wrapped it tightly to neutralize the inevitable odor. Decades worth of chemical reactions likely rendered an amateur mummification job. I don't think she had a criminal mind. She didn't plan the murder, and when it happened, she had to think fast, he says. In the mind of someone who commits a crime of passion, that kind of makes sense. Still, how did Corey get away with murder? At least 3 factors may explain this: Corey's consistent cool and grace, and Worley's estrangement from his family and the lack of documentation about his life, and the suppression of the corpse's stench. But perhaps the murder's obscurity is primarily owed to a 4th, socioeconomic factor: the othering and invisibility of 2 poor, sexually complex black people navigating internal and external turmoil in 1960s and 70s America. A definitive answer remains elusive and probably always will. It's unsurprising. Corey was part of a highly marginalized world, and her life, even the part ripe for a campy tabloid headline, attracted little attention. Still, whatever brought these two together and whatever happened the day of Worley's death, Dorian Corey has made an indelible mark.
Number 5.
He approached the man leaning against a building on the 4200 block of University Way Northwest in Seattle, Washington. To anyone casually glancing over at the interaction, it would have appeared random, inconsequential, nothing to note. It was an area known for criminal activity, but this was benign. Just a simple cigarette and chewing gum survey. Any takers would earn $5 for their participation. Except the survey had ulterior motives, and the man armed with 3 packs of cigarettes and 3 packs of gum didn't work for any distributor of the two products. He was a plainclothes detective executing a creative plan to collect the evidence authorities needed to close out an unsolved Maine homicide case from 35 years in the past. He only hoped that the sole participant in the survey was game to make $5. The murder of 70-year-old Augusta resident Blanche Kimball in 1976 remained a cold case for decades until a new tip, new DNA technology, and a clever idea brought all the loose ends together. 70-year-old Blanche Kimball lived in Augusta, Maine in 1976. She was 3 years retired from her job at Togus Veterans Administration Center, where she worked as a dental technician and practical nurse. Much of Blanche's life is a mystery. She was born in Albany, Maine to her parents Elliot and Fanny Bell. Blanche never married and had no children. I get the sense that Blanche had a small family, a sibling who passed away in 1916, a half-sister born when Blanche was 10 years old, and 2 aunts with a handful of cousins who lived out of state as of the 1970s. Blanche lived on State Street in Augusta, a stretch that is now lined with gas stations and car dealerships, and a few apartment buildings on either side of the 4-lane road. The Kennebec Journal described Blanche Kimball's home as a large 2-floor wooden frame house, though it was leveled years ago, and the land paved into a parking lot. But in 1976, Blanche lived alone in that big house, though she was known to rent rooms to temporary boarders on occasion. The neighbors kept an eye on Blanche's comings and goings, as neighbors do. In mid-June of 1976, those neighbors started to realize they hadn't seen the retired woman who lived next door for days, maybe even weeks. In fact, the last time anyone saw Blanche Kimball was Memorial Day weekend. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Blanche had come or gone from her State Street home. Concerned, the neighbors called police to check in on Blanche. It was June 12, 1976. When Augusta Detective Sergeant Carroll Clement knocked on the front door of 352 State Street in Augusta, announcing himself to whoever might be inside. Knock, pause, listen. He repeated the pattern several times, but with each knock came the same response: silence. He jiggled the knob to see if it had been left unlocked. An unlocked front door in central Maine in the mid-70s would not have been unusual, but with just a quick half-turn of the handle, Detective Clement found the door locked from the inside. He knocked one more time before deciding that force was the only way into Miss Kimball's home. The home was in what he described as general disarray. Messy, unkempt maybe, but it was impossible for him to tell if that was out of the ordinary for Blanche Kimball. But as he wound through the first-floor rooms and into the kitchen and living space, Detective Clement knew he wasn't dealing with just a messy house. 70-year-old Blanche Kimball had been dead for several days when Detective Clement found her there on the floor. Shards of glass scattered around her and blood spatter on the kitchen cabinets. She'd apparently been stabbed, but investigators would have to wait for the autopsy to confirm exactly what happened to Miss Kimball. One thing was clear, though: they had a homicide investigation on their hands.